Hello and welcome to October in Royals, Rebels, and Romantics Land. We have such fun episodes this month, and also we're starting something new. I call it What's Past is Prologue, and it's the part of my business where I'm really looking at using history to help us learn what's possible today. So we'll be looking at some characters, some events, some traditions of history, and really exploring those in some special episodes each month. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to this really exciting episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am here with author Rebecca Batley, and she is going to share with us a book she has just written about one of the most fascinating and I think maybe one of the least understood characters of the Wars of the Roses period, and that is Anne Neville. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to talk to you. So I'm going to ask if you'll hold up your book. I just love the cover of it because the image, that's perfect. The image of this young woman, and she was a young woman when all these things were happening, is so fascinating. So I want to ask you what got you interested in history, sort of in general, and then in this time period, and then how did you land on Anne Neville for your book?
Yeah, I don't remember ever not being interested in history. I guess, like most people, I came to medieval England via the Tudors. Anne Boleyn in particular, love her. Then I guess, obviously, I make history my history is my career. It's what I do. So yeah, I guess I studied the Tudors a lot, and obviously to understand the Tudors, you need to go back in time a bit, start looking at the Wars of the Roses, and as always, the history is all about the men. The Kingmaker, the Duke of York, Edward IV, Richard III, and the women don't get much of a voice. In fairness, there is a reason for that, but I wanted to try and give Anne Neville as much of a voice as it is possible to do with the constraints of the sources that we have.
So can you start by just placing her within that context? So you've mentioned some of the men, and she has relationships with different men in that story. In fact, some of the most important men end up being related to her in some way. So can you sort of place her?
Yeah, she's pretty much related to them all in one way or another. She is, of course, the Kingmaker's, Richard Neville's second daughter. She has an elder sister, Isabel, who marries George, Duke of Clarence, who is the brother of both Edward IV and Richard III. She marries Edward, Prince of Wales, Edward of Westminster, who is the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, first of all. And then, of course, she later and most famously marries Richard III.
Right.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot more detail than that, but the basics are she's related to all the major players, and she has a ridiculously illustrious history. Both going right back, sort of, she's descended from Edward III. She is pretty much completely designed for the role she ends up in, just perhaps not quite the way she ends up doing it.
Right. I think that is so interesting because she, of all the women, she seems perhaps, as you say, destined or prepared to be Queen of England, you know, a queen consort. And she manages to marry the heir to the Lancastrian claimant to the throne, who is Henry VI, who was actually on the throne. So she marries his son and heir. And then later, she ends up marrying the man who's not considered the heir at that time, but ends up being the Yorkist king. So can you tell us a little bit about her first marriage to Prince Edward. It seems like almost everybody's named Edward. I mean, a
It's
good
very annoying,
half of
isn't
the
it?
men are named Edward. It does make the whole time period more confusing than it needs to be, because there's always an Edward we're talking about. But she is married to Prince Edward, who is the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, and who is in line to become the next king. So tell us a little bit about how that marriage happens and what do we know about her first marriage?
All right. When I first started writing the book, I assumed we knew very little. Strange thing is, we actually know quite a lot. And whereas we always sort of thought, well, I certainly always thought that Anne and Edward wouldn't really know each other, wouldn't really have got to know each other. The truth is, they actually spent quite a lot of time together. So I'm going to try and keep this as quick as I can. So Warwick leaves England in 1407 after the Lancastrian rebellion against Edward IV. He claimed he has nothing to do with it. Obviously he does. The fact the men on the field are shouting out, a Warwick, does not really help his argument. They're also keen on Clarence, who of course is travelling with Warwick and Isabel at this time. They have no choice, essentially, but to flee England. Traditionally, they have them making this desperate, panicked flight across England before they can escape to France. Warwick has literally packed up his family and ran. It didn't quite happen like that. He has time to stop off at Bristol to sort out some guns. But he plans to take his new ship, the Trinity, to France with Anne and Isabel and everybody on it. When Earl Rivers prevents the Trinity from landing, Warwick does panic, and he panics for real this time. So they make a mad, desperate dash to Dartmouth and they sail for France. Warwick has been captain of Calais in the past for quite some time, but he is prevented from landing. Obviously, they're more afraid of the king than they are of him. This is where, I suppose Anne's story gets personal, in that her sister is heavily pregnant at the time. During this truly horrific voyage, where Warwick is desperately trying to land the ship, Isabel goes into labour. Traditionally, Anne would have been kept, she was unmarried, she would have been kept well away from all these events, but on the ship, obviously, there's not much you could do. Isabel labours for what must have seemed like forever. She nearly dies. Her baby does die. She loses the family heir, if you like, until they're finally forced to land in France. They move further down the coast and they find lands that are controlled by King Louis, who is happy to let them stay for a while, anyway. Louis XI has a treaty with Burgundy, so he can't openly support Warwick. But he does offer shelter to the women, which is quite an important distinction, because sheltering, damsels in distress is quite different from sheltering, an attainted traitor who's facing execution by his king.
Right.
Yeah. What basically happens then is Louis is very keen to promote an alliance between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, who, with her son, Prince Edward, is also in France. Warwick has no choice now but to try to invade England. There's no other way out of this mess for him. It's sort of do or die. And as part of this alliance, of course, there is a proposed marriage between Anne, Neville, and Prince Edward. Whether or not this was Warwick's plan all along, we're not entirely sure. There is a good bit of evidence to suggest that perhaps he was thinking about it. Because let's face it, he's always got one eye on the throne, and George has not proved himself the best ally in the world. Suddenly it's not looking... Suddenly, Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward is looking rather more appealing. Margaret, of course, not a happy bunny. She is not a fan of Warwick in any way. In fact, she forces him to kneel before her for 20 minutes at in Angers Cathedral. and swear his loyalty on the Holy Cross before she will even contemplate doing a deal with him, which frankly I think is quite reasonable. And this is where Anne starts to come into the narrative a little bit more, because she now starts to be mentioned as someone who needs protection, as someone who's becoming powerful. Louis and his brother, for example, on the 30th of July that year, swear themselves to protect their most beloved cousin Anne from any danger that might befall her. Up until now, all the talk has been about Isabel. But Isabel is no longer pregnant. George is a lot less useful than he once was, although how much he was to start with is rather debatable. But yes, now the focus is very much on Anne. What we know about Edward at this time is a little less clear. Obviously, he's been Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, for as long as he could remember. He's been knighted, but he's largely been raised in exile. He was tutored by a man named John Fortescue, who said he was very skilled at arms and at fighting. The Milanese ambassador says things like he knows of nothing but war, he would make the whole world bleed if he could. But we know he also was taught music and history, and the importance of friendship and loyalty. They were betrothed by proxy at Angers Cathedral on the 25th of July, 1470. And pretty soon they met up, essentially, because by the end of July, Anne is in the company of Margaret of Anjou and Edward, and they're traveling towards Razilly Castle, where one of them falls sick because Louis is forced to send them some herbs, in the hope, of course, of making a cure. But either way, it's fine. Now this is the part where they actually get to spend some time together. They're at Amboise Castle, Razilly, and later Amboise. And we know they were allowed to spend time together with a chaperone. There were gardens. We expect they played things like cards. They would have eaten together and probably got to know each other pretty well. The reason for this is not that anyone was being nice, but because they were distantly related, they required a papal dispensation to marry, the scope of which it is not possible to go into in any detail here. But it basically takes until the 28th of November for the right dispensation to turn up, which means they get a good 4 or 5 months in each other's company, getting to know each other, and spending time together, basically in France. Anne is being treated very much as a princess. Louis spends an absolutely enormous sum, nearly £4,000, on keeping the Lancastrian court, and particularly Anne and Edward in the style to which they are accustomed. Because, of course, if Henry VI is restored and Edward and Anne become king and queen, this makes perfect political sense. It's a gamble, but it's looking like a safe one at this time. Edward is in trouble. Events in England are not going so well for him. So he obviously think it's a good idea. They finally marry on the 30th of December 1470 at Amboise, and the marriage is consummated immediately, which obviously again is really important. They need Anne to fall pregnant as soon as possible. Secure dynasty. Edward IV, of course, has many legitimate sons. They need one to further their cause as much as possible. And they are confident, so confident, in fact, by the 19th of October, Louis is proclaiming Henry VI as being restored all over France. And Anne is referred to as the Princess of Wales, which, although people think that's a fairly modern title, it actually goes back right the way to Joan of Kent. So yes, Princess of Wales. And Anne would have felt that responsibility. Joan of Kent was something of a legend even then. She, of course, was required to be beautiful, pious, virtuous. And it wasn't enough, of course, for her to appear to be so. She had to actually be so. And I suppose the culmination of her life as Edward's wife was when they entered Paris, and they were greeted essentially as almost the King and Queen of England. They were feted, there were tapestries, there was music. The palace had to be got ready in an awful hurry because there was nowhere else suitable in apparently the whole city for them to stay. Because Louis was becoming anxious at this point, not to give offence, because you need to make sure that they were suitably entertained, really, and housed. And it was all going very well. Until, Edward landed in England again.
Right. So let's pause before we bring Edward back, because at this point, Henry VI can be restored, but his health isn't great.
No.
So it was believed that Edward and Anne would not be waiting years and years and years, right?
Definitely not. Edward had been sick for some time with whatever, they termed it brain sickness. Today, there's a lot of academic ink spilt on what his illness may have been. Some sort of catatonic schizophrenia, maybe. But either way, yeah, he's not expected to live for very long.
So Henry VI expected not to live long. And so all eyes on, as you said, Edward and Anne now, not just as prince and princess, but soon to be king and queen, if we can get them restored. And it is interesting that you said that Louis, the King of France, was talking as if Henry VI, it was just a done deal. He was already restored. Everything was fine. Because the assumption was the Lancastrians would prevail. Okay, so I just want to make sure everybody knows that's looking really settled, because I think that part of the story often gets lost.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Edward IV would have a very different take on this.
Yes.
But yeah, I think certainly on the international stage, it was certainly approaching that a Lancastrian victory is looking certain here. The restoration of Henry VI is looking like it's happening, and that it's going to be, he's going to stay put for now.
Right. And so Anne had every reason to believe that.
Yeah. She had the extent to which she believed in her father is something we can't quantify, of course, but he had given her no reason to doubt him, really. His only major mistake in all of this had been the loss, the sailing for France and the loss of Isabel's child.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it could still all be viewed like he's done the right thing at every turn.
Okay.
It's not, there's nothing so far that in this messed up context of the Wars of the Roses looks like it's a terrible, tragic mistake.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But that wheel of fortune just keeps spinning. Okay. So now take us on, because I just wanted to pause for that moment. So thank you. So now take us on, because we've had this successful first marriage consummated in hopes of Anne becoming pregnant right away, because having a son, that is a really big deal. Okay. So take us on.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got Anne. They sail for England. They land at Weymouth on the 13th of April, and they make for Cerne Abbey, or at least that was the plan. The Battle of Barnet is fought the next day. Anne's father is killed. Edward wins the day. Suddenly, this has all gone wrong.
And it's Edward IV who wins the day, not
Edward IV.
Edward. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, there's so many Edwards.
I know, there's so many Edwards. That's why
Yeah. So again, to cut a very long story short, the aim of the Lancastrians now is to meet up with Jasper Tudor in Wales, fight Edward IV and defeat him. To this end, they ride to try to cross the river. They aim for Tewkesbury. And the arrival of Edward IV gives us a very vivid picture of Anne right now, actually, riding for 36 hours straight on horseback next to Margaret of Anjou, desperately trying to make this rendezvous, because they've gone from a strong position. With the death of Anne's father, they are in serious trouble. So yeah, I mean, obviously she must have been exhausted. Yes, battle is obviously inevitable. They make for Tewkesbury, and they, according to tradition, they stay at a place called Gobez Hall. There are several sources that mention this as where the women were staying prior to the battle, and Prince Edward before he goes off to fight. It can't be proven beyond doubt, of course. The building is of the right age, but there are a few minor discrepancies that make it seem. But either way, they're in the vicinity of Tewkesbury, and on the 4th of May, Anne said goodbye to her husband for the last time. He was doing what he had been born to do, which is to fight for the right to rule England. If he won, he would essentially restore the family and everything would be fine. If he lost, everything was lost. It was quite literally do or die. And of course, he loses. The Lancastrians lose at Tewkesbury. Edward IV is understandably in no mood to be merciful. So Anne's husband, as well as all of their allies, are killed. There is some question as to how Anne's husband was killed, Prince Edward. Most sources say he dies in the thick of the fighting, but there is the chronicler Hall tells us that he was killed before the king by one of the king's brothers, either Gloucester, the prime candidate, or Clarence. There is no way to, obviously, there's no way to know this. But of course, Shakespeare, as well as history, likes us to believe that Anne's second husband killed her first. It's a possibility. But if he did, I mean, obviously this is not Richard's story, but I feel I should just mention that even if he did, he was playing fair. Prince Edward would have done exactly the same to him if the tables had been reversed. This isn't sort of rank treachery or anything like that.
Right.
If he'd killed him, he would have expected it. This was what was required. Edward had made it perfectly clear that there was no quarter to be given at all. This needed to be ended as far as was possible.
Right. And it had been an ongoing, these battles in the Wars of the Roses between Lancastrians and Yorkists had been going on for years. And so it's nothing new that if you are the leader, and Prince Edward really was, his father was not there fighting. He was really fighting for the Lancastrians. And so as the head really of that Lancastrian army, he would have known. It would not have been unexpected, even if he was killed after the battle, right?
They would know. No, same as like Somerset or any other man fighting that day. They knew that if they lost the battle, they were done.
Yeah.
That was the risk they took. There is a interesting, just sort of an afternote to the battle concerning Anne. Obviously, when news came to them, they were devastated, distraught, all the things you would expect. But Anne and Margaret were taken to Tewkesbury, where the arrival tells us that she had to view, or at least did view, the body of her husband. She could hardly have avoided seeing the quartered, dead bodies of their allies on display. Whether she saw him or not is unknown. I mean, the arrival also tells us that she attended a service in his memory, but we know that would not have been possible because Tewkesbury was not consecrated at the time. It had been deconsecrated by the sheer amount of blood. So no religious services were taking place. But I thought that was rather a sobering thought.
Right.
I guess that she might have had to endure that. She is still so very, very young. And even if we can't put emotions onto these things, so even if she hadn't loved him, even if she hadn't cared about him, even if she despised him, it's still a horrific thing to see.
Well, and it's her future too. At that moment, that was also the death and destruction of the future she had expected as his consort.
Absolutely. But I was just surprised, I guess, of the sheer sort of immediacy or brutality that she had to. I mean, she could hardly, even if she didn't see Prince Edward, she would have had to see the horrors in Tewkesbury that day, which,
yeah.
because they brought home the reality of what they were doing, if nothing else did.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is her status then? I know that Margaret of Anjou was captured and was imprisoned. What happens to Anne?
Right. This is the part where the story gets very tricky. To put it very simply, Anne is placed in the custody of her brother-in-law, George, Duke of Clarence, and her sister, Isabel. Again, we don't really have time here to go into the minute detail. Read the book.
Yes. There are more details there.
About the mighty Neville inheritance, which is enormous, and it's essentially split between Isabel and Anne, because Warwick, of course, had no son. This inheritance would pass to their husbands. Clarence wanted control of Anne's inheritance as well as Isabel's. So he essentially takes custody of her, and she spends a good amount of time at Cold Harbour House in London, which is their London home. Contrary to legend, she is not kept as a maid and forced to work in the kitchens. But she is somewhat hidden away. She is obviously, this is family embarrassment. And more importantly and more politically, nobody wants Anne exercising her own power, claiming her own inheritance. She actually makes several applications to the king, Edward IV now, and Elizabeth Woodville, his queen, to be allowed to come to court to petition for her own inheritance. These are shut down immediately. This is not helpful. Anne is possibly the greatest heiress in the country. Hence, she is hidden away, safely out of mind. Edward doesn't particularly want Clarence to have her inheritance, so he is stalling his brother as well. But it's basically best for everybody if Anne Neville is just quietly living with her sister in London and not doing very much at all. Which of course makes her very difficult to trace, because there's very few documentary evidence, there's very little documentary evidence mentioning Anne at all at this time. It's basically a bit of a blank.
Right, because she represents this part of family that sort of betrayed Edward IV, if you might want to think about it that way. Although really it wasn't, it was Clarence. Yeah. But now it's kind of an embarrassment because she was married to Prince Edward. So you just kind of keep her under wraps.
Very much.
Yeah. Okay. So she's quietly kept away, although not as a maid. She's quietly kept away. And then
enter Richard.
Right.
Who, just like both his brothers, really would quite like Anne's inheritance. Yes. This details are not clear at all. But at some point in early 1472, Richard makes contact with Anne, or between them, they reach some kind of agreement whereby she is going to leave Clarence's house, not with his permission, and Richard is going to take her into sanctuary. He cannot take her to his house, because if he takes her straight from Clarence's house, takes her and marries her, then he is guilty of abduction and rape, which would not allow him necessarily her inheritance. So Richard wants to do this by the book. Yeah. The romantics would like this to be a great love story. Unfortunately, I'm not saying it's not, but unfortunately there's no evidence that it is either. So basically, on the 16th of February, 1472, Anne sneaks out or bribes the servants or somehow leaves Clarence's house, and Richard takes her straight to sanctuary at the College of St. Martin le Grand in London. That was a well-known sanctuary where particularly known for shielding thieves and murderers, actually. So it I think it was more likely just the most convenient place. Because Richard doesn't want Anne acting independently either. We've got to remember, this is not a great escape. He wants her inheritance. It is also clear, though, that Anne did choose this. Clarence obviously is furious, and at court there erupts a row between the brothers, with Edward IV trying to mediate. Clarence says, all right, you take Anne, but I keep her inheritance. Richard says, I don't think so. Richard, sorry for the romantics here, but Richard makes it perfectly plain that he doesn't want Anne if he can't have her inheritance. Yeah. But by taking Anne into sanctuary, she now has a little bit of, I wouldn't say independence, but she is free of anyone's guardianship, which means she is free to marry. How and when she marries Richard is unclear. The most likely date is sometime in summer 1472, but the first reference to her certainly as being Richard's wife isn't until June 1474. So there is a bit of a gap here, and there is basically no evidence. There is no way to tell exactly what has happened here. The most likely scenario is that she has essentially said, I wish to marry Richard, and without much to do, really, they marry and move on. The issue of the inheritance will rumble on absolutely forever. How it'll be divided, who gets what. There are other random nephews thrown into the mix. It's all a bit of a pickle. But Anne and Richard are now married. Anne is once again his sister-in-law to the Queen, and things are looking up. Sort of.
Right. I mean, think of what in a very short period of time, she was married, things looked really good, then things totally fell apart. Then she's practically in custody with her sister and George in a lot of ways, and now she's married again and sister-in-law to the Queen. I mean, it really is a lot for a young woman.
It is a huge amount for her to have gone through in such a short space of time. And I've said there's definitely scope for her to have some agency here. I think very few would dispute the fact that when she left Clarence to marry Richard, she did it of her own free will and she knew what she was doing. Whether she thought this was a great decision or whether it was simply the lesser of two evils, who knows? But I suppose in a way it sort of gets her what she wants, because she is married to a rich, powerful man, the brother of the king, no less. And now she gets to return to Midland Castle, where she had spent much of her youth. And yes, she gets to become a wife and mother, which is what would have been drilled into her from childhood. This was her destiny. Yeah. So you hope she was maybe happy with that for a while.
Well, and she did have a son, which is at that time seen as a big success.
Yes.
In any family.
Yeah. Likely, again, nothing about this period is certain. Likely in 1476, she gives birth to a son who at Middleham. So she has in that way fulfilled her wifely and dynastic duty.
Right.
Yeah. And it does seem likely that she did have trouble bearing children. She only has the one son. There is a fleeting reference in the Tewkesbury Annals to another son. But most historians today agree that this is a bit of a typo. It's a bit of a medieval typo as opposed to another child who was born and died. But again, because we have no definite dates, I mean, I suppose it's a possibility, but she didn't fall pregnant when she was married to Prince Edward. And as far as we can tell, she doesn't fall pregnant again. Her mother also had trouble conceiving. She only had 2 daughters, born many years apart. There are fleeting references to her perhaps having miscarriages in between. So you imagine Anne was probably mightily relieved.
Right. To have a child and have that child be a son. So technically she's, fulfilled. She can tick that box.
Yes.
So, and it is, of course, they name their son Edward, as all mothers seem to at this time. So we have another Prince Edward. I just find that kind of funny. All right. So she's going along. She's the wife of the king's brother. She has a son now. And then there's another big twist in her life when Edward dies. When Edward the Fourth, not her son Edward at this point. Edward the Fourth dies in 1483. So
Edward the Fourth dies very inconveniently.
Yes.
His death is not expected in any way. Few plans had been sort of put in place, and his sons are still very young. We all know what happens next. Whether by design, plan, coincidence, Richard III, Anne's husband, takes the throne, usurping his nephews. What happens to his nephews, I'm not getting into. I'm not touching that. I try not to in the book as well. I try to avoid that question.
Right.
And as far as Anne's concerned, most of this time she is spent up in Middleham, where she is busy endowing churches, sending money to monks, and occasionally deputizing for her husband by sending instructions to the Council of the North at York. So in that sense, it's not really a huge amount to do with Anne.
Okay.
But Richard does take the throne, and of course everything changes. I think it's quite important to stress that we have absolutely no hint about Anne's feelings about this. The only evidence that exists are letters that are being sent north, essentially newsletters, keeping her apprised of what's happening. Her personal feelings, we have no idea. So what she thought, what she believed, what she knew is lost to us. I don't think as historians you can reliably speculate about that, as much as we would all love to. And so Anne Neville finds herself as Queen of England.
Right. Something she thought she was going to be as the Lancastrian queen, and now she's the Yorkist queen. So tell us, because this one really happens, probably less expectedly as when she was married to the Prince of Wales, because that was part of a long-term plan, and this happens quickly, however it was brought to be. So tell us about Anne becoming queen and coming down to London for the coronation, because that was a pretty spectacular moment. However she felt about Richard taking the throne, she finds herself being crowned Queen of England.
She does. And here finally we actually have some good historical evidence, because of course the wardrobe and the courts and the chronicles keep close account of actually what's happening. Of course, this coronation was supposed to be for Edward V. So it all happens quite quickly, and this is in fact the first double coronation since Edward II married his wife Isabella. That didn't go so well either. So there are a lot of things changing very quickly, but obviously preparations pick up at the end of June, beginning of July, and everyone is put to work. And strangely, we now get really minute details coming through. One of my favorite is we actually know the name of one of the seamstresses who worked on the lace and silk for Anne's dress for the coronation. Her name was Alice Claver, and she had been apprenticed as a child as a silk worker. She had married Richard Claver, who was a mercer, but very interestingly, she traded in her own right, which meant she could manage her own money. She was responsible for her own debts, and she could secure contracts in her own name. All of this was possible if you declared your position before the alderman of the city and it was approved. So in this sense, Alice is operating in exactly the same way as her husband was, which I really find fascinating because I love, a common woman with agency here.
Right. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And as early as 1480, she had been supplying lace and silk to King Edward IV. And now she is engaged to make the lace for Anne's robes, and white lace and white silk and a form of gold lace to decorate her mantle for the coronation.
Oh, that's wonderful detail.
Yeah, I just love the fact that suddenly we have names, we have real people. On the 3rd of July, we see Anne and Richard exchanging the traditional gifts, as a king and queen would have before the coronation. Richard gave Anne 4 yards of purple cloth of gold and 7 of purple velvet. So we know purple is definitely a theme here. And then the next day they travel to the Tower of London to await the coronation, which takes place 2 days later. We know Anne is wearing a combination of white, purple, gold lace, and then her robe is a red one. So it would have looked pretty spectacular.
Right.
Yes. As I mentioned to you in our emails beforehand, one of the craziest things I found when reading the very detailed account of the coronation is that for the ceremony, Anne's train is actually carried by Margaret Beaufort.
Yes.
Which, I mean, her husband, Lord Stanley, is carrying the mace ahead of now King Richard. So they're right at the heart of things. But my goodness, I just imagine what Margaret Beaufort and Anne Neville have to talk about on coronation day.
Yes, and as time goes on, those conversations, as Margaret gets less and less enchanted with Richard's reign, let's say. So that is an amazing moment, as you mentioned, and I love you bringing that up.
Yeah, and of course, Margaret at this time is already looking for alternatives. She's already looking, she's in contact with Elizabeth Woodville. They're already looking for a way out of this. So yeah, the tension must have been on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, following on from that, we do have there's a whole list of ladies who attended Anne during her coronation, but one of which is the Countess of Surrey, called Elizabeth Tilney. And she had been a long time lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth Woodville. You could possibly go so far as to say they were friends, because Elizabeth Tilney had accompanied Elizabeth Woodville into sanctuary. She was one of the ladies chosen to do so. And she had attended the birth of Prince Edward, later Edward V. And now here she was accompanying Anne Neville on her coronation. So again, you've really got to wonder, I mean, with all this so fresh in their minds.
Yes. A couple of months ago, they all thought Edward V would be the king. So this is recent.
Yes. And even best case scenario, assuming that Richard has sent Edward V and his brother off to, live comfortably somewhere, even if we assume the best of him, he's still usurped the throne here, which I don't think even the Richard III Society would dispute that Edward V, had a good claim to the throne here. So,
well, and the people at the time, we know from some records that they were stunned about everything that happened. So
yes, and we can only imagine that sense of sort of incredulity, if you like, must have been present during amongst Anne's ladies that day. Yes. I mean, for Elizabeth Tilney, she knew Edward V well. She knew Elizabeth Woodville extremely well.
Right.
How she must have felt. Obviously we're moving into the realms of speculation here, but you can't help but think it would have been a bit of a tense.
Well, just the timing of it makes us, I think it's reasonable to think it would certainly have been a surprise It wouldn't have
Yes.
been expected.
Yes. Yeah.
So now Anne is queen consort, and her son is now the heir to the throne, and her husband is king. So what is life like for her at that point?
Anne travels around a fair deal, with her ladies, essentially keeping the court. So she is providing, she's not always with Richard. Richard is off securing support, dealing with various issues all over the country. Anne goes to Windsor, she goes to Nottingham, she travels around. Again, on a personal note, we know that she does choose to have her half-sister, an illegitimate daughter of the Kingmaker, Margaret Huddleston, with her at this time. This wouldn't necessarily have been usual. As an illegitimate half-sister, you would not have expected anything whatsoever. But she chooses to have her with her at the court, which, as the late, great Dr. Anne Sutton has argued fairly conclusively, I think, means that we can almost prove that there was some sort of close, or at least close relationship between the two women, that they liked each other, because there is simply no other reason for Anne to choose to have her with her during this time, which I think is quite nice, really. The idea of her having a friend.
Yes, someone who
Yeah.
will be with her and that she can count on, because a lot of people in her life have been taken away. So
yeah. And you're surrounded by the likes of the Duchess of Norfolk, Elizabeth Tilney, Margaret Beaufort. You need a hand.
You need a real friend.
Yeah.
Okay, now tragedy strikes. First her son, and then her own health. So it's a short-lived sort of queenly time.
It is. I think it's, again, quickly important to mention that there is no, later tradition would have Anne as a very sick woman, even at the coronation. There is no evidence for this. The coronation goes on for many, many hours, and there is not a single reference to her becoming sick, weak, having to retire early, anything of that sort. So I think the idea that Anne was long-term sick, or had a wasting disease that was already taking hold, if it was, it's not manifesting itself at this point. Anne has a healthy son. She's Queen of England. This is going great.
Right.
Yeah. She's pretty much at the pinnacle of her life. And then, as you've just mentioned, sadly, tragedy strikes. Sometime between the 4th and the 27th of April, after a short and sudden illness, her son dies. The news is brought to Anne and Richard while they're at Nottingham. And obviously they, sorry, I'm losing control here. Obviously they are absolutely devastated.
Yeah.
There is no, there's no future for them or their dynasty or their hard-fought plans without a son and heir. And Anne has not fallen pregnant again. And if she has, she's not carried the baby to anywhere near term. So the chances of a living son and heir are slipping away now. Which of course essentially means that Richard may need a new wife.
Right.
And there's nothing sentimental about this. Anne would have been aware that this was a purely practical consideration. I have to include that there is not much evidence for this, or for how Richard might have proceeded, because now Anne does sicken. She does fall ill, and she sickens very quickly as well. And on the 16th of March, the day of an eclipse, famously, of course, she dies.
And how old is she when she dies?
Oh my goodness. I want to say 28.
I mean, this is a young,
Yeah.
I guess what I want to say is this is a young woman when you think of everything that's happened to her. 2 marriages, both of which very high pressure situations right in the heart of court. And then becoming queen, having a son, losing her son. I mean, it's just an extraordinary amount to happen to anyone over a long lifetime. And it happens to this woman over a very short lifetime.
Yeah, she is still very young when she's still very young when she dies. Um yeah, there is a lot of evidence. I actually opened the book by talking about Anne Neville's death, because at the time of her death, there were, of course, the court was alive with rumours. The king, I have no wish to judge Richard here, but there are rumours that the king is going to replace his wife, although later allegations of poison are completely unfounded. But these rumours are entirely natural because Richard needs a son, and with Anne sickening, his options are limited. Henry Tudor is threatening from across the channel. It's very clear by this point that he is going to have to fight Tudor sooner rather than later. Of course, there's a lot of mutterings. People are defecting. People aren't. But it is very much a hotbed of gossip and scandal. One of the most scandalous, of course, is the famous rumour that Richard is intending to replace Anne with her niece, Elizabeth of York, which was distasteful, actually, back even then. But the evidence of this does rest on a couple of dubious sources. So again, we probably shouldn't condemn Richard too readily here. And there is evidence that he's looking elsewhere for another potential bride. He is certainly casting his net about, he's thinking about it. But again, this doesn't necessarily express a lack of sentiment or care for Anne. He literally has no choice.
Right.
Yeah.
His survival really depends on his marrying and having a son. He really needs that. So
yeah.
All right. So we've told the story of Anne, and I think we've really sort of rescued her, thanks to you, from obscurity. That we have this very young woman who, and I love how you point out that there were times she was making the decisions and she was playing the hand she was dealt in situations to the max. I mean, although we don't hear a lot about her, it's not because she wasn't doing anything. She was doing everything she could. And whether it was getting to know the first Prince Edward and preparing to be queen in that situation, or getting herself out of Clarence's house, which she did to decide to marry Richard. I mean, all those things show a lot of her will and her taking steps when she could. So I love seeing that about her. So thank you. So if there's one thing that readers can take away that you would love for people to take away about Anne, one thing, what would it be? What would you really love us to know about Anne and take away?
That's a really difficult question. I think actually, as you said, that she did make some choices here. And I guess I'd like them to know the reality of her life. So the young woman who saw her sister labor on a ship and then lose her child in the most horrific circumstances when she was a teenager. This is a real woman. She was flesh and blood, and she might be out of sight for most of her life, and she might be very difficult to get a clear impression of. But just occasionally, like on the ship, or like when she's leaving Clarence's house, she is a flesh and blood, or she was a flesh and blood woman, who I think deserves to be remembered and studied far more than she is.
That's great. I really appreciate that, because there is a really important story there.
Yeah.
And speaking of important stories, can you give us a little hint about what you're working on now?
Well, my next book is going to be on Edward Seymour. the Lord Protector under King Edward VI, brother to Queen Jane Seymour, but more importantly, also his 2 wives. Catherine Filial, who disappears into a nunnery after a great scandal, or shall we say mystery, of some sort. And then the utterly indomitable Anne Stanhope, who serves every one of Henry VIII's queens, is obviously married to Edward Seymour, survives his execution, is thrown in the Tower herself, and still emerges to be granted a large house and a lot of money by Queen Mary I. Despite the fact they disagreed on everything.
Yes. These were not buddies or kindred spirits, she and Mary I, by any means.
Well. There is some interesting evidence about Anne Stanhope's relationship with Mary I that I've come across while researching the book. So
okay, this is good. This is good. This is something to really look forward to. Well, thank you so much. Now, as far as social media, we will put your links in the show notes, but tell us just really quickly where we can follow you and find out more.
Okay, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, and I think I'm on Threads as well. Social media I'm not so great at.
Okay. But we can find you, and we'll have those links for you on Instagram and Twitter for sure. And then I'll check out Threads, see if I can find you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for chatting with us about this fascinating woman. I think Anne Neville is a story that needs to be told, and I am so glad that you zoomed in on her and told this story, because it really is, it's easy to just focus on the men, but women like Anne really were an important part of everything happening in the Wars of the Roses and beyond. So thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I'm now really looking forward to the wives of Edward, Edward Seymour, another Edward, but Edward Seymour here. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening. And we hope to see you again soon as we see how history shows us what's possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. And can I please ask a favor? We could really use your help spreading the word about the podcast. If you could share with a friend, leave a rating, leave some comments, I would really appreciate it. And also, maybe you'd consider becoming a patron. A big shout out and thank you to all of my patrons. You make our work possible. Thanks for listening, and hope you keep looking around and seeing how history shows us what's possible.